Hello everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The day I forgot how to speak. Picture this. You're standing in front of a vending machine in a freezing New York subway station, clutching a crumpled dollar bill, your mouth wide open, but not a single sound comes out. And this is not a comedy sketch. This is your life. Your actual Tuesday afternoon. And the only thing louder than the rumbling train is the humiliating silence inside your own head. Because you have studied English for 12 years. You have passed exams, you have read novels, you have watched Friends without subtitles at home. Yet right now, in this moment of absolute need, your brain has decided to take a vacation and left you with the linguistic ability of a goldfish. And the vendor is staring at you like you are either having a stroke or trying to communicate through interpretative dance. And all you wanted was a small black coffee, but the word coffee has evaporated from your memory as if it never existed. And you open your mouth again, and what comes out is a pathetic, almost whispered co. Before you give up, shove the dollar back into your pocket and walk away with your tail between your legs, pretending you never wanted that coffee anyway. But inside you are screaming because this is not the first time, this is the 1,000th time, and every single time it happens, a little voice in your head says, "See? You are useless. You will never speak English like a normal person. You are wasting your time and everyone else's." And that voice, my friend, is the real enemy. Not the vocabulary you forgot, not the grammar you messed up, not the accent that gives away your origin, but that relentless, cruel inner critic that convinces you to quit right when you are about to break through. And I know that voice because it lived in my head for years. It screamed at me during job interviews. It whispered during dinner dates. It mocked me when I tried to tell a joke in English and nobody laughed. And I want to tell you something that no textbook will ever admit. That voice is not telling the truth. It is just scared and fear. As every neuroscientist will confirm, is the single biggest obstacle to language acquisition. Because when your amygdala, the fear center of your brain, lights up like a Christmas tree, it literally shuts down your prefrontal cortex. The part that processes language, meaning that the more terrified you are of making a mistake, the more mistakes you will actually make. And the more you avoid speaking, the worse you become, creating a vicious cycle that has destroyed more language learners than irregular verbs ever could. And I remember reading about Stephen Krashen's effective filter theory years later and laughing bitterly because that filter was not a filter in my case. It was a solid steel wall. And every time I felt judged, embarrassed, or inadequate, that wall rose higher and higher until I could barely whisper my own name. And the cruel irony is that I was actually good at English on paper. I had a high TOEFL score. I could write essays with complex sentences. I understood CNN news perfectly, but the moment I needed to speak in real life, in real time, with a real person looking at me, my brain turned into a bowl of mashed potatoes, and that is when I realized something that changed everything. I had been learning English as a subject, as a set of rules to memorize, as a trophy to display, but I had never learned it as a way to connect, as a bridge to another human being, as a messy, beautiful, imperfect tool for sharing who I really am. And the day I forgot how to say coffee was actually the day I started learning for real. Because hitting rock bottom in a subway station forced me to ask the question that every struggling learner must eventually ask. What if I stopped trying to be perfect and just try to be understood? And that question cracked open a door I did not know existed, because suddenly the goal was not flawless pronunciation or native-like grammar. The goal was simply to make someone nod, to make someone smile, to make someone say, "I get it." And once I let go of the illusion that I could ever pass for a native speaker, I felt a weird sense of freedom, like taking off a corset after a long dinner. And I started speaking more, and the more I spoke, the more my brain rewired itself, because neuroplasticity is real, and every time you force yourself to speak despite the fear, You are literally carving new neural pathways. You are telling your amygdala to calm down, because this is not a life or death situation. It is just a conversation, and the worst that can happen is you say something silly and both of you laugh. And guess what? That is actually a gift, because laughter is a social bonding mechanism that makes people like you more, not less. And studies have shown that people who make mistakes are perceived as more approachable and authentic than those who speak robotically perfect. English, so your broken English might actually be your secret weapon, not your weakness. And I wish someone had told me that on that freezing subway day instead of letting me walk home in shame, but maybe you needed to hear it right now. Maybe you were sitting in your room feeling exactly what I felt. Maybe you have been studying for years and still freeze when someone asks, "How are you?" And you want to give up, you really do, but before you close this video, let me ask you something. What if the reason you cannot speak is not because you are bad at English, but because you have been trying to speak someone else's English? The English of textbooks and exams, the English of perfect conditionals and phrasal verbs, instead of your own English. The one that carries your accent, your culture, your unique way of seeing the world. And what if that English is not just acceptable, but actually wonderful because it is yours and nobody else on this planet talks exactly like you? So when you open your mouth, you are offering something irreplaceable. You are offering the story of a person who left their home, their family, their language to build something new, and that takes guts, that takes courage, and courage has nothing to do with fluency, I promise you. The most memorable conversations I have ever had were not with native speakers using elegant vocabulary. They were with fellow immigrants like me, stumbling through sentences, laughing at our mistakes, helping each other find the right word. And in those moments, English was not a wall. It was a playground. And I want you to know that the person who could not buy coffee that day is the same person who is now teaching English to hundreds of students. Not because I became perfect, but because I became brave, and bravery is a decision you can make right now, not tomorrow, not when you feel ready, but right in the middle of your fear, because readiness is a myth, and the only way out of the shame spiral is through it. So if you are watching this and your heart is pounding because you recognize yourself in my story, take a deep breath and know that you are not alone. And the fact that you are still searching for help, still watching videos, still hoping to improve, means you have already won half the battle. Because the people who give up do not watch language videos, they do not seek out stories like this, they just stop trying, but you are here. Which means somewhere inside you, there is a spark that refuses to die, and that spark is enough. And now I am going to tell you exactly how that spark turned into a flame in my life, how I went from that subway station to a wedding, to motherhood, to divorce papers, and finally to a classroom where I now stand as proof that your past can become someone else's future. But that is a story for the next section, so if you want to know how a woman who could not order coffee ended up teaching English for a living, stay with me, because this is not just a language lesson, this is a life lesson, and I promise you by the end of this video, you will see yourself differently, you will see your mistakes differently, and you might even start to love the sound of your own voice in English. Imperfect and beautiful as it is, so let us continue this journey together. And remember, the day you forget how to speak is not the day you fail. It is the day you finally understand what speaking truly means. From Saigon to Silicon Valley. If you think learning English is hard, try learning how to live a completely new life while not knowing how to say bathroom without turning crimson. Because that was me stepping off a plane at San Francisco International Airport on a blistering August afternoon in 2014, carrying a single 23-kilogram suitcase packed with 3 pairs of jeans, a winter coat I had bought in a panic because someone told me California gets cold at night, and a heart so heavy with hope and terror that I could barely breathe. And let me tell you, the first thing that hit me was not the freedom or the opportunity, or any of that American dream nonsense they sell you in movies. It was the smell, a weird mix of airplane fuel, overpriced sandwiches, and the sharp, metallic scent of a place where nobody knew my name. And I walked out of that terminal thinking I was prepared. I had studied English for 12 years. I had watched Hollywood films. I had memorized idioms. I had even practiced small talk with a tutor from Ohio who told me my accent was charming. But charming accents do not help you when the taxi driver asks where to miss. And you freeze because you have never actually said an address out loud in English. And you mumble something that sounds like, street number, please? And he just stares at you through the rearview mirror with that particular American expression that says, I am trying very hard to be patient, but you are testing me. And I gave him a piece of paper with my cousin's address scribbled on it, and he nodded and drove off. And I sat in the back seat watching palm trees whiz by, wondering if I had made the biggest mistake of my life. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about moving to America. The culture shock does not hit you like a wave. It hits you like 1,000 tiny paper cuts, one for every moment you realize that your normal is not normal here, that the way you greet people, the way you eat, the way you laugh, the way you argue, the way you love, all of it is suddenly up for negotiation. And the first paper cut came when I walked into a grocery store and a complete stranger smiled at me and said, "How are you today?" And I literally looked behind me to see who they were talking to because in Saigon, strangers do not smile at you unless they want to sell you something or ask for directions. And I stood there frozen, my brain frantically searching for the correct response, and I finally mumbled, "Fine, thank you, and you?" in the robotic tone of someone reciting a textbook dialogue, and the stranger just smiled wider and walked away. And I realized they did not actually care how I was. It was just a ritual, a verbal handshake. A social script that every American knows by heart but nobody teaches in ESL class. And I felt like an actor who had stumbled onto a stage without knowing the play, and the second paper cut was the silence. Oh my God, the silence. Because Saigon is a city that never sleeps. It is a symphony of motorbike horns, street vendors yelling, karaoke blasting from every other house, and the constant, comforting hum of millions of people living on top of each other. But in California, especially in the suburbs where my cousin lived, the silence was so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. And at night, when the temperature dropped and the crickets started their quiet chorus, I would sit by the window and stare at the empty street and cry. Not because I missed home. I did, but that was not the whole story. I cried because I felt invisible. Like I had been erased from the world and replaced with a ghost who could not speak properly. And that ghost spent her first 3 months in America speaking as little as possible, ordering food by pointing at menus, nodding at neighbors without making eye contact, and avoiding phone calls like they were landmines. Because every conversation was a potential trap where my limited vocabulary would betray me, and the worst part was that I knew, intellectually, that I was not stupid. I had a university degree, I had run a small business in Vietnam, I had managed employees and negotiated contracts. But in English, I sounded like a confused child. And that mismatch between who I was and how I sounded created a cognitive dissonance so painful that I started to believe the voice in my head that said, "You are lesser here, you are smaller here, you do not belong." And psychologists have a name for this. They call it stereotype threat, which is the anxiety you feel when you are afraid of confirming a negative stereotype about your group. And for immigrants, that threat is everywhere. Every time you open your mouth, you are not just speaking, you are representing your entire country, your entire culture. And if you mess up, it is not just you who looks bad, it is everyone like you, and that pressure is crushing, absolutely crushing. And I remember reading a study that found immigrants who constantly worry about their accent actually perform worse in language tests because the anxiety consumes working memory. Meaning the more you stress about sounding foreign, the more foreign you actually sound. And that is exactly what happened to me. I was so terrified of making mistakes that I made more mistakes, and the more mistakes I made, the more I retreated, and the more I retreated, the worse my English became, until I was trapped in a prison of my own fear. And the key to that prison, I would later discover, was not more vocabulary or more grammar drills. It was a simple, radical decision to stop caring about sounding American and start caring about being understood. But that decision took years. And before I could make it, I had to survive my first winter, which was not just cold in the weather sense, it was cold in the soul sense. Because winter in New York, where I moved after 3 months with my cousin, is a different beast entirely. It is not just snow and ice. It is a psychological assault. It is darkness at 4 in the afternoon. It is wind that cuts through your coat like a knife. It is the cruel realization that you are trapped indoors with nothing but your thoughts and your broken English for company. And I remember the first time I saw snow fall. I was enchanted for exactly 5 seconds, and then I realized I had no idea how to walk on ice, how to layer clothes, how to keep my apartment warm without bankrupting myself. And I spent that winter eating instant noodles and watching children's cartoons because they were the only things I could understand without straining. And every time a character said hello or goodbye in that slow, exaggerated way, I felt a pang of something between humiliation and hope, because if a cartoon could teach a child to speak, maybe it could teach me too. But hope is a fragile thing in a foreign land, and I had to hold on to it with both hands while everything else slipped away. And looking back now, I realized that my first year in America was not a failure. It was a necessary collapse. Because you cannot build a new self without tearing down the old one, and I had to lose my old identity, my old confidence, my old way of being in the world, before I could discover who I really was. And who I really was turned out to be someone much tougher than I ever imagined. Someone who could survive a subway breakdown, a winter storm, and 1,000 silent humiliations, and still wake up the next morning and try again. And that person, that stubborn, ridiculous, hopeful person, would eventually find love in the most unexpected place, not in a classroom or a textbook, but in a series of broken English messages exchanged with a man who also struggled with words. And that is where our story gets really interesting. Because sometimes the things you cannot say perfectly are the things that connect you the most. And the gaps in your language become the spaces where real intimacy grows. But more on that in a moment. First, let me tell you about the winter that almost broke me, because that winter is the reason I am here today. And it might be the reason you keep watching, because if I survived that, you can survive anything. The first winter that broke me. Winter in New York is not a season, it is an attack, a relentless, brutal assault on your body and your mind. And if you have never experienced a real winter, let me paint you a picture. Imagine waking up to a world that has been erased. Because the snow falls so thick and so fast that it buries cars, swallows sidewalks, and turns familiar streets into alien landscapes. And you look out your window and all you see is white, 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 like the universe has hit the reset button and forgotten to tell you. And then you try to step outside, and the cold hits your face like a slap, a dry, stinging slap that steals your breath and makes your eyes water. And within 30 seconds, your fingers go numb, your nose starts to run, and your brain, which was already struggling with English, now has to process the additional information that you are actually freezing to death. And that was my life for 3 months. Trapped in a tiny apartment in Queens with a radiator that made sounds like a dying animal and a landlord who spoke English so fast I could not understand a single word he said, so I just nodded and paid my rent and prayed the heat would not give out, because if it did, I had no backup plan. No friends to crash with, no family within 3,000 miles. Just me and my broken English, and a space heater that I bought from a thrift store for $20 and which I was terrified would burn the building down. And I spent those months in a state of suspended animation, moving from my bed to the kitchen to the bathroom and back, like a ghost haunting my own life. And the silence was the worst part, because in Saigon, there is always noise, always life. Always someone calling your name. But here, the only sounds were the howling wind and the occasional screech of a snowplow. And I would sit for hours staring at the snow piling up against my window, wondering if I would ever feel warm again. Wondering if I would ever feel anything again, and the isolation did something to my brain, something I did not understand at the time, but which I now recognize as a classic stress response, because when you are cut off from everything familiar, your amygdala, that primitive alarm system in your brain, goes into overdrive, constantly scanning for threats, and the problem is, it cannot tell the difference between a physical threat and a social threat. So the loneliness of being stranded in a foreign country activates the same neural pathways as being chased by a predator. Meaning your body is flooded with cortisol, the stress hormone, and cortisol is the enemy of language learning because it literally shrinks the hippocampus, the part of your brain that forms new memories. So the more stressed I became, the worse my English got. And the worse my English got, the more stressed I became. A vicious cycle that left me curled up on my mattress at 2 a.m, sobbing into a pillow because I could not even remember the word for blanket, and I would lie there and think, this is it. This is where I die. Not from the cold, but from sheer linguistic incompetence. A woman who traveled halfway around the world to freeze to death in a queen's apartment because she could not ask the super to fix the radiator. And it sounds dramatic, I know, but that is the thing about depression. It does not care if your reasons are dramatic or not. It just sits on your chest and refuses to move, and the hardest part was that I could not explain this to anyone because I did not have the words. I did not know how to say, I feel like I am disappearing, or I am scared all the time, or I do not know who I am anymore. Because those sentences require a level of emotional vocabulary that I simply did not possess, and even if I had possessed it, who would I say it to? I had no friends, no community, no one who spoke my language and understood my culture. I was a tree that had been uprooted and planted in concrete. And winter was just the universe's way of reminding me that I did not belong. And then one night in late January, something broke inside me. Not in a dramatic way, not with a crash or a scream, but quietly, like a thread snapping, and I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. Photos of my family, my friends, my old life, and I started crying. Not the quiet tears I had been crying for weeks, but ugly, heaving sobs that came from somewhere so deep I did not know it existed, and I cried until I had no tears left, and then I sat there, empty and exhausted, and I did something I had not done in months. I opened a notebook and I started writing, not in English, but in Vietnamese, because I needed to feel my own voice again. I needed to feel the shape of my own language in my mouth, and I wrote about everything, the cold, the loneliness, the fear, the shame, the tiny moments of triumph that nobody saw. Like the time I successfully ordered a pizza without hanging up in panic. Or the time I understood a joke on a sitcom and laughed a full second before the laugh track. And as I wrote, I realized something that would change everything. I was still here. I had survived the coldest winter in a decade. I had not died. I had not given up. I was still fighting. And that counted for something. It counted for everything because the only way to fail is to stop trying. And I had not stopped. I had just been resting, and that rest was necessary because you cannot sprint through a marathon. You cannot learn a language in a panic. And maybe, just maybe, the reason I was struggling was not because I was bad at English, but because I was trying too hard, forcing my brain to perform when it was exhausted and terrified. And that is when I made a decision that sounds small but was actually enormous. I decided to stop pressuring myself to improve and start allowing myself to just exist in English, to listen without understanding, to speak without perfection, to make mistakes without apologizing. And the next morning, I turned on the TV, and instead of trying to find a serious news channel or an educational program, I found a children's show. A bright, Colorful cartoon with simple words and slow speech and lots of repetition, and I watched it like a child, not analyzing, not taking notes, just absorbing, and I felt my shoulders drop. I felt the tension in my jaw release. I felt my brain start to relax. And that is when I learned the most important lesson of my entire language journey. You cannot learn a language through fear. You can only learn it through curiosity and play. And I had been treating English like an enemy to be conquered instead of a friend to be made. And once I started treating it like a friend, everything began to shift, slowly at first, then faster, like a snowball rolling down a hill. And that shift would eventually lead me to the most unexpected love story of my life. A love story that started with a message from a stranger who also struggled with words. But before I get to that, let me tell you about the day I realized that being imperfect in English was not a weakness. It was my greatest strength. A love note in broken English. Do you believe in fate? I did not even a little bit. Because fate seemed like a luxury for people who had the time and emotional bandwidth to believe in things that could not be proven. And I was too busy surviving to entertain such romantic nonsense. But then one night, in the middle of my second winter, when I was so lonely, I had started having full conversations with my houseplants. I received a message that would completely reroute the trajectory of my entire existence. And it came not from a dating app or a mutual friend or any of the conventional channels, but from a random language exchange website I had joined on a whim, hoping to practice English with strangers who would not judge me. And the message was from a man named David, and it read, "Hi, I see you from Vietnam. I want to learn Vietnamese.
You can teach me.
I can teach English. Good idea?" And I remember staring at that message for a solid minute, not because it was romantic or poetic, but because it was so grammatically incorrect that it made me feel instantly better about my own English, because here was an American, a native speaker, writing like a toddler, and I thought, oh, so it is not just me, even native speakers mess up when they are learning. And that small realization, that tiny crack in the wall of my shame, was enough to make me reply, and I wrote back, "Yes, I teach you Vietnamese. You teach me English. We try together," and I hit send without overthinking it, and that simple exchange, that messy, imperfect, beautifully broken exchange, became the foundation of everything that followed, because what started as a language lesson quickly became something much deeper, much stranger, and much more powerful, because David and I began messaging every day, not just about grammar and vocabulary, but about our lives, our fears, our dreams. And the remarkable thing was that our limited language actually forced us to be more honest, more direct, more vulnerable. Because you cannot hide behind fancy words or clever metaphors when you only know 3,000 of them. You have to say what you actually mean. And what I meant, what I discovered I meant, was that I was tired of being alone, tired of pretending I was fine, tired of performing strength when I was falling apart. And David, in his broken Vietnamese and his imperfect English, kept saying things like, "You strong," and "I proud of you," and "You not alone." And each of those simple sentences hit me like a brick. Because nobody had said those things to me in months. Nobody had really seen me since I left Vietnam. And I realized that David saw me not despite my broken English, but because of it, because when you strip away all the linguistic polish, all the cultural performance, all the masks we wear in our native languages, what is left is just two people trying to understand each other. And that is the purest form of communication. That is the thing that makes us human. And I started to fall in love not with his perfect grammar, which did not exist, but with his patience, his kindness, his willingness to sit with me in my confusion and not rush me, and he would send me voice messages in English, speaking slowly and clearly. Not because I asked him to, but because he knew I would understand better that way, and I would send him voice messages in Vietnamese, tripping over tones and laughing at myself. And he would listen and say, "Beautiful, say it again." And I would, and that repetition, that gentle, loving repetition, was the best language lesson I ever received, because I was not learning English from a textbook. I was learning it from someone who cared about me, and neuroscientists have actually studied this. They have found that emotional engagement enhances language acquisition because the brain releases dopamine, the feel-good chemical, when you are in a positive, connected state, and dopamine not only makes you feel good, it also improves memory consolidation, meaning you remember words better when you learn them in a context of love and trust. And that explains why I progressed more in 3 months of messaging David than I had in 3 years of formal study. Because I was not just memorizing, I was bonding. And every new word I learned was a new way to connect with him. A new bridge across the gap between our cultures. And the irony was delicious, because here I was, a woman who could not order coffee, building a relationship in a language I barely spoke, and it was working. It was actually working, because the foundation of our love was not eloquence, it was effort. It was showing up every day and trying, failing, laughing, and trying again. And that is the thing that most people do not understand about language learning. It is not about being fluent, it is about being willing. It is about being willing to look foolish, to make mistakes, to be misunderstood, and then clarify, to stumble and get back up. And David and I stumbled constantly. We misinterpreted each other. We sent messages that made no sense. We had arguments that were really just miscommunications, but we always circled back. We always asked, "What did you mean?" And "Can you explain differently?" And that process of clarification, that back and forth, that dance of mutual understanding, deepened our connection in ways that perfect communication never could, because when you have to work to understand someone, you appreciate them more. You value the effort, you cherish the breakthrough, and I started to realize that my broken English was not a liability. It was a filter. It was filtering out people who did not have the patience, the curiosity, the emotional intelligence to meet me where I was. And David passed that filter with flying colors. He did not just tolerate my mistakes, he celebrated them. He kept a list of my funniest errors and would read them back to me when I was feeling down, and I would laugh until I cried. Because he made my imperfections feel like gifts, not failures. And that is when I knew, that is when I really knew, that I was in love with him. Not in spite of my broken English, but because of it, because my broken English had brought us together. It had stripped away all pretense and revealed something real, something raw. Something that could only exist between two people who were brave enough to be imperfect together. And 6 months after that first message, we decided to meet in person, and I was terrified, absolutely terrified, because what if the magic was only in the messages? What if the real David was different? What if my English was so terrible in person that he would run away? But I went anyway. I took a bus to his city. I walked into a coffee shop, and there he was, this tall, awkward man with kind eyes and a nervous smile. And he looked at me and said, "Hi. You are more beautiful than your English." And I laughed so hard I almost cried, because that was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to me. And in that moment, I knew I had found something rare, something precious, something worth fighting for. And I also knew that this was just the beginning because our love story was not going to be simple. It was going to be messy and complicated and full of misunderstandings, but it was going to be ours. And we were going to build it with whatever words we had, however imperfect they were, and that is exactly what we did. But building a relationship across cultures is not just about love. It is about navigating a minefield of differences. From the way you express anger to the way you show affection, and those differences, I would soon discover, would test us in ways we never expected. But before we could face those tests, we had to survive the most public test of all, our wedding, where I would have to speak my vows in front of hundreds of people. And let me tell you, nothing exposes your linguistic limitations quite like promising to love someone for the rest of your life in a language you still struggle with. The wedding vows I couldn't pronounce. Picture this. You are standing at the altar in a white dress that cost more than your monthly rent. Your hands are shaking. Your heart is pounding so loud you can barely hear the soft music playing in the background, and 100 pairs of eyes are fixed on you, waiting for you to speak, to say the words that will bind you to the person you love for the rest of your life. And when you open your mouth, what comes out is not the beautiful, poetic vow you practiced in front of the mirror for weeks, but a jumbled, awkward, mispronounced mess that makes half the guests chuckle and the other half look confused. And you feel that familiar hot flush of shame creeping up your neck, that familiar voice in your head screaming, "See? You cannot even say your own wedding vows properly. What kind of wife are you going to be?" And that was me on my wedding day, standing in a beautiful garden in upstate New York, trying to tell David that I would cherish him forever. But the word cherish came out sounding like cherish, and the word treasure came out like pressure, so I accidentally promised to pressure him forever, which is not exactly the romantic sentiment I was going for, and I watched David's face as he struggled to keep a straight expression. And I saw his eyes crinkle with that familiar warmth, and he leaned in and whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "Just say, I love you." That is all they need to hear. And I did. I said, "I love you," with every ounce of my being, and the whole room erupted in applause. And in that moment, I realized something that would change my relationship with English forever. Nobody in that room cared about my pronunciation. Nobody was keeping score. They were not there to judge my grammar. They were there to celebrate love, and my love was real even if my vowels were not. And that is the truth that most language learners never discover because they are too busy hiding behind their shame. But I learned it standing at that altar, looking into the eyes of a man who had never once corrected my mistakes, who had always responded to my broken English with patience and kindness, and who had just taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. Communication is not about perfection. It is about connection, and if you can connect with another human being, if you can make them feel seen and heard and loved, then your English is good enough. It is more than good enough. It is actually perfect in the only way that matters. And I looked out at the crowd, and I saw my Vietnamese family sitting next to David's American family. And I saw them laughing together, even though they could barely understand each other. And I realized that love transcends language. It always has. It always will. And my wedding, with all its linguistic disasters, was proof of that. But there was another lesson I learned that day. A harder lesson, one that would take years to fully understand. And it came when David's mother stood up to give a toast, and she spoke in rapid, emotional English that I could barely follow, and I smiled and nodded and pretended to understand. But inside I felt that familiar anxiety rising, that fear that I was missing something important, that I was being left out of a moment that should have been mine. And I looked at David, and he saw my confusion, and he squeezed my hand and said, "She said she is so happy to have you in our family. She said you are the best thing that ever happened to me." And I felt tears sting my eyes, not because of the toast, but because David had become my translator, my interpreter, my bridge to a world that was still sometimes foreign to me, and I loved him for it. But I also hated it a little because I did not want to need a translator for the rest of my life. I wanted to understand my own mother-in-law's words directly. I wanted to be part of the conversation, not just a guest at the table. And that tension, that push and pull between gratitude and resentment, between dependence and independence, would become a recurring theme in our marriage, because loving someone does not erase your frustrations. It just makes them more complicated. And David, bless his heart, was not always patient. He was human. He got tired of explaining things. He got frustrated when I asked, "What did they say?" for the 100th time, and I would see a flicker of irritation cross his face before he smoothed it away. And that flicker would cut me deeper than any criticism ever could, because it confirmed my deepest fear, that I was a burden, that my English was a problem he had to manage, not a gift we shared. And those moments, those small moments of impatience, would accumulate like snowflakes, silent and cold, until they formed a mountain of resentment that nearly buried us. But before I tell you about that mountain, about the breakdowns and the near divorce and the long, painful climb back to each other, I need to tell you about the other challenge that tested us daily, and it was not a language barrier, it was a culture barrier. A clash of expectations and habits and unspoken rules that made us wonder, more than once, if we had made a terrible mistake. Because it turns out that loving someone from a different culture is not a fairy tale. It is a full contact sport, and you have to be willing to get bruised, and nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the cultural collision that happened in our kitchen, because that is where our differences came to a head. That is where our two worlds crashed into each other with the force of a freight train. And I will never forget the night I watched David cook a pot of pasta and I thought, this man cannot possibly be serious. Because he opened a can of plain tomato sauce, poured it over the noodles, and called it dinner. And I looked at him with the kind of horror that you usually reserve for crime scenes, and he looked back at me with pure, genuine confusion. And in that moment, we were not speaking English or Vietnamese. We were speaking entirely different languages of love, because to him, dinner was fuel, something you eat and move on from. But to me, dinner was love, it was history. It was a ritual that connected me to my mother and my grandmother and generations of women who had stood over hot stoves stirring pots of broth for hours, and his indifference to that ritual felt like an indifference to me, to my culture, to everything I was, and I know that sounds dramatic. But that is the thing about cultural differences, they are never really about the surface thing. They are always about identity, about belonging, about being seen and understood. And I did not feel seen in that moment. I felt invisible, erased, replaced by a can of cheap tomato sauce. And David looked at me and said, "What's wrong?" And I tried to explain. I tried to tell him that food was not just food, that it was memory and love and home, but I did not have the words. I did not have the vocabulary for that kind of conversation, and so I just shook my head and said, "Nothing," and ate the pasta in silence. And that silence, that accumulation of unsaid things, would grow heavier and heavier until it finally broke us. But that is a story for later. Because right now, I want to tell you about the first time I realized that our cultural differences were not just about food. They were about everything, from how we raised our children to how we expressed anger to how we defined happiness itself. When culture collides in the kitchen, I used to believe that love could conquer all barriers, that if you loved someone enough, everything else would somehow work itself out. And then I watched David open a can of plain tomato sauce, dump it over a pot of boiled noodles and call it dinner, and in that moment, I realized that love is powerful, but it is not magic. It does not automatically bridge the gap between two people who were raised on opposite sides of the world, and I stood there in our tiny kitchen, gripping the counter so hard my knuckles turned white, trying to find the words to explain why this meal, this sad meal, felt like a personal insult, not because I was ungrateful, but because food in my culture is not just food, it is history, it is identity. It is the accumulated wisdom of generations of women who learned to coax flavor out of humble ingredients, who understood that cooking is an act of love, that the time you spend chopping garlic and simmering broth and tasting and adjusting is time you are giving to the people you care about. And to reduce that sacred ritual to a can of store-bought sauce felt like a rejection of everything I was, everything I came from. And I tried to explain this to David, I really did, but my English failed me. Because how do you explain nuoc mam and zao and co and all the other Vietnamese words that have no direct translation? How do you explain that the smell of fish sauce frying garlic is the smell of my grandmother's kitchen? That it is the smell of safety and belonging and home? And David just looked at me with that patient, slightly confused expression that I had come to know so well, and he said, "But it's just dinner. We can order pizza if you want." And I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the whole pot across the room and shout, "It's not just dinner. It's never just dinner. It's everything." But I didn't. I just took a deep breath and said, "It's fine." And I ate the pasta and smiled and pretended everything was okay. But everything was not okay, because that kitchen moment was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger problem. A problem that touched every aspect of our lives, from how we argued to how we made love to how we imagined our future. And I started to notice all the other cultural collisions that we had been ignoring, the way David expressed anger openly and loudly, while I had been taught to swallow my anger and smile, the way he hugged his friends and said, "I love you," casually, while I reserved those words for the most intimate moments, the way he saw parenting as a team effort where both parents were equal. While I had been raised to see mothers as the primary caregivers, and these differences were not just quirks. They were tectonic plates grinding against each other, and the friction was creating earthquakes, small ones at first, then bigger ones. And every time we had a fight about something seemingly trivial, like whose turn it was to do the dishes or how to discipline our daughter, it was really about something much deeper. It was about whose culture was going to win, whose way of life was going to define our family. And I was terrified, absolutely terrified, that I was losing, that I was being slowly erased. That my children would grow up knowing nothing about their Vietnamese heritage because I could not find the words to pass it on. And that fear made me cling to my culture even harder. It made me insist on speaking Vietnamese at home, on cooking Vietnamese food, on celebrating Vietnamese holidays, and David, bless him, tried to understand. He really did. He learned to eat fish sauce. He learned to say "Xin Chow." He even tried to learn a few phrases in Vietnamese, but there was always a gap, always a distance, always something he could not quite grasp, and I resented him for that gap, even though it was not his fault because the gap was not about him. It was about the impossibility of ever fully translating one culture into another. And I remember reading a study that said bicultural couples experience significantly higher levels of stress than monocultural couples because they are constantly negotiating identity, constantly asking, who am I in this relationship? And whose way is the right way? And the study concluded that the most successful bicultural couples are not the ones who eliminate their differences, but the ones who learn to celebrate them, who turn their cultural friction into creative energy instead of destructive conflict. And I read that study and I thought, that sounds great in theory, but how do you actually do that when you can barely say, I'm frustrated, without tripping over the grammar? And that was the real challenge, not the cultural differences themselves, but the fact that we did not have a shared language to talk about them. Because English was my second language and David's first, so every conversation about culture was automatically tilted in his favor. He had all the vocabulary, all the nuance, all the cultural references, and I was fighting with one hand tied behind my back, trying to express complex emotional truths with a vocabulary that was, at best, functional, and that imbalance created a power dynamic that I hated. Because I was the one who always had to ask for clarification, I was the one who always had to explain myself twice. I was the one who always felt like I was catching up, and that feeling, that constant, grinding sense of being behind, wore me down over time. It made me withdraw. It made me stop sharing my thoughts because it was just too hard. And the more I withdrew, the more David felt like I was shutting him out, and the more he felt shut out, the more he pushed, and the more he pushed, the more I retreated. And we were stuck in this toxic dance, this spiral of miscommunication and unmet expectations. And I started to wonder if we had made a terrible mistake, if love was really enough to overcome all of this, or if we were just two stubborn people trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. And then we had a daughter, and suddenly the stakes got much higher, because now we were not just negotiating our own relationship, we were building a culture for another human being. We were deciding what kind of person she would become, and every parenting decision became a battleground, a referendum on whose values would prevail. And I found myself fiercely, protectively clinging to my Vietnamese identity, not because I was anti-American, but because I was terrified that my daughter would grow up not knowing who I really was, and that fear, that primal maternal fear, would eventually push us to the brink of divorce, because when you are that scared, you do not communicate well, you do not compromise, you dig in your heels and fight. And that is exactly what I did. I dug in so hard that I almost destroyed everything. And it took hitting rock bottom to realize that the problem was not David, it was not America, it was not even my English, it was my own fear, my own shame, my own refusal to accept that I could be both Vietnamese and American, that I did not have to choose, that my daughter could have both cultures and be richer for it, but I did not understand that yet. I was too deep in my own pain to see clearly, and the pain was about to get much worse before it got better. The baby who taught me real English. When my daughter was born, I held her in my arms, and I made a silent promise to myself, a promise that I would teach her everything I knew, that I would pass down my language, my culture, my history, and I imagined long conversations in Vietnamese, bedtime stories about dragons and fairies, the same stories my grandmother had told me, and I felt a surge of hope because here was a new beginning, a chance to rebuild my identity in this strange country through this tiny, perfect human. But what I did not anticipate was that my daughter would turn the tables completely, that she would become my teacher instead of my student, and that the most important English lessons of my life would come not from a textbook or a classroom, but from a 2-year-old who could barely form complete sentences, and it started innocently enough, with her first words, "Mama" and "Dada" and "more" and "please," simple words that she repeated over and over and over again, and I found myself repeating them with her. Not because I needed to learn them, but because the repetition was comforting, it was grounding. It was a meditation that somehow quieted the frantic noise in my head, and as she grew, her vocabulary expanded. And she started correcting me without even knowing she was doing it. She would say, "No, Mommy, it's I want water," not "I want waters." And I would laugh and repeat it correctly. And she would nod with the solemn authority of a toddler who had just discovered she knew something her mother did not. And I realized that I was learning English through her, not through study but through osmosis, through the endless, exhausting, beautiful repetition of daily life. Because the thing about having a child is that you say the same things 1,000 times. You say, "Put on your shoes," and "brush your teeth," and "time for bed," so often that the words become part of your muscle memory, and before I knew it, I was speaking English more fluently than ever, not because I was trying but because I had no choice, and the other mothers at the playground, the ones I had been too scared to talk to, suddenly became my teachers, because my daughter would run up to them and say, "Hi, my name is Lily. What's your name?" And they would respond, and I would have to follow her. I would have to step into the conversation whether I was ready or not. And those women, those American mothers with their easy smiles and their endless small talk, became my language partners without even knowing it. And I learned more from them than I ever learned in school, because they taught me the real English. The English of playdates and birthday parties and pediatrician visits. The English that actually matters when you are raising a child in a foreign country. And I remember one day, a woman named Karen came up to me and said, "Your daughter is so cute. How old is she?" And I said, "She 2. And Karen smiled and said, "My son is 2 too. They can be friends." And she did not correct my grammar. She did not make me feel stupid. She just opened a door and invited me in, and I walked through that door, trembling but determined. And Karen became my friend, my first real American friend, and she would talk to me slowly, not because she was patronizing me, but because she genuinely wanted me to understand. And she would repeat things without making a big deal about it. She would just say the same thing in a slightly different way until I nodded, and I realized that this was what real language learning looked like. It was not about memorizing vocabulary lists or doing grammar exercises. It was about being included, about being part of a community, about having people who cared enough to make sure you were not left behind, and I started to notice that my daughter was doing the same thing for me. She would translate the world for me without even realizing it. She would point at things and say their names in English, and I would repeat them. And sometimes she would giggle at my accent and say it like this, Mommy, and I would try and we would both laugh, and those moments, those small, silly moments were the best language lessons I ever had because they were infused with love, with play, with connection. And neuroscience tells us that the brain is wired to learn best in states of positive emotion, that dopamine and oxytocin, the bonding hormones, actually facilitate neuroplasticity, meaning that when you feel safe and loved, Your brain is more receptive to new information. And I was feeling safe and loved. I was feeling like I belonged. And that feeling was more powerful than any textbook ever could be. And I started to realize that my English was not the problem. My fear was the problem, and my daughter, in her innocence, was showing me a way out of that fear. She was showing me that you do not have to be perfect to be loved. You just have to show up, and I showed up day after day at the playground, at the grocery store, at the library story time, and I spoke my broken, imperfect English, and people responded, not with judgment, but with warmth, and I started to feel like maybe I could do this. Maybe I could actually live in this country and speak this language and raise my daughter to be bilingual and bicultural. And then I had my second child, a son, and the demands doubled, and I found myself speaking English even more. Because my daughter was now speaking English to her brother, and I had to keep up, I had to understand what they were saying to each other. And my son, who was born in America, spoke English from the very beginning, and I would speak Vietnamese to him, and he would understand. But he would respond in English, and I felt a pang of something, a sadness, a fear that my Vietnamese was slipping away, that my children would never really know my mother tongue, and that fear would grow and grow until it became a chasm between me and my children. Because I wanted them to be Vietnamese, but they were also American, and I did not know how to hold both truths at the same time, and that tension, that pull between two worlds, would eventually push me to the breaking point. But before I got to that breaking point, I had to face the hardest truth of all, that my marriage was not immune to this tension, that the same cultural collisions that had almost destroyed us in the kitchen were now playing out in our parenting. And David and I were fighting more and more, not about big things, but about small things, about how to discipline, how to praise, how to set boundaries, and every argument was really about the same thing, whose culture was going to win, and I was so tired, so exhausted from the constant negotiation, that I started to wonder if it would be easier to just give up, to just let go, to walk away from the whole thing and start over, and that wondering, that dangerous wondering, would lead me to a place I never thought I would go. A place so dark and lonely that I almost did not come back. But before I tell you about that dark place, let me tell you about the day my daughter corrected my English, and I realized that she was not just learning from me, I was learning from her. And that reversal, that beautiful, humbling reversal, was the key to everything. Divorce papers or love letters. I will not sugarcoat it. There were nights when I sat alone in our living room, long after David and the children had gone to bed, staring at a blank screen with a divorce attorney's website open in one tab and my wedding photos open in another. And I would hover my finger over the mouse, not because I had stopped loving David, but because I was so exhausted, so utterly drained from the constant effort of being a foreigner, a mother, a wife, and a person who had to translate every single thought before it could leave her mouth, that the idea of walking away felt like the only way to finally rest. And the cruel irony was that I could not even understand the divorce papers, because they were written in dense, impenetrable legal English that made my head spin. So I would sit there, trapped between wanting to leave and not being able to read the documents that would let me go, and I would laugh bitterly at the absurdity of it all. Because here I was, a woman who had survived a war-torn childhood, who had crossed an ocean to build a new life, who had given birth to 2 children in a foreign country. And I could not even figure out how to file for divorce because my English was not good enough. And that realization, that pathetic, humiliating realization was both my lowest point and my turning point, because it forced me to ask myself the hardest question I had ever faced. Was I really so broken that I could not even leave properly, or was I actually not broken at all, just tired, just scared, just overwhelmed by the weight of carrying two cultures, two languages, two identities on my shoulders every single day? And the answer, when it finally came, was neither. I was not broken, and I was not fine. I was somewhere in between, a place that has no name in any language. A place where you are too Vietnamese to be American and too American to be Vietnamese. A place where you belong nowhere and everywhere at the same time, and that in-between place, that limbo, had been slowly eroding my marriage. Because I had been carrying it alone, I had been so focused on my own struggle that I forgot David was struggling too. He was struggling to understand a wife who sometimes seemed like a stranger, a wife who would withdraw without explanation, who would cry without warning, who would get angry over things that made no sense to him. And he had no framework for understanding my experience because he had never been an immigrant. He had never known what it felt like to be reduced to a stereotype, to have your intelligence questioned because of your accent, to be treated like a child because you could not find the right word, and the gap between us, the gap that I had been so focused on, was not just a language gap, it was an empathy gap, a gap between two people who loved each other but could not fully understand each other's pain. And that gap was widening every day, every argument, every silent dinner, every night we turned our backs on each other in bed. And I remember the night it finally came to a head. We had been fighting about something trivial, something I cannot even remember now. But it escalated, as it always did, into a full-blown argument about everything, about the past, about the future, about who we had become. And I screamed at him in English, and he screamed back, and I realized that we were not even fighting about the same thing. I was fighting about being invisible, and he was fighting about being shut out, and we were both right, and we were both wrong. And in the middle of that screaming match, I just stopped, and I said, I don't know who I am anymore. And David stopped too. And he looked at me with a mixture of anger and sadness and love. And he said, I don't either, but I know I love you. And I started crying. Not the quiet tears I had been holding in for years, but the ugly, desperate sobs of someone who had finally given up pretending. And David came over and held me, and we stood there in our messy, cluttered living room, surrounded by toys and laundry, and all the detritus of a life we had built together, and I felt something shift, something crack open, something that had been frozen for a very long time, and I realized that the problem was not our love. It never had been. The problem was that we had stopped seeing each other. We had become so focused on our own pain that we had forgotten the other person was hurting too, and that moment, that raw, ugly, beautiful moment, was the beginning of our healing, not the end, and the healing would not be easy. It would require therapy and tears and a lot of uncomfortable conversations, but it would also require me to finally, fully, accept that my English was never going to be perfect, that I would always have an accent, that I would always make mistakes, and that was okay. More than okay, because my English was my story. It was the story of a woman who had crossed an ocean and survived, who had loved and lost and loved again, who had built a family in a foreign land, and that story was worth telling, even if I stumbled over the words. And that acceptance, that radical, life-changing acceptance, would eventually lead me to the most unexpected place of all, a classroom, where I would stand in front of other immigrants and say, I was where you are, I know how hard it is, and I am here to tell you that you can do this. And that classroom would become my sanctuary, my purpose, my way of turning my pain into something beautiful. But before I could get to that classroom, I had to go through something even harder. I had to forgive myself for being imperfect. I had to stop apologizing for my accent. I had to stop shrinking myself to make other people comfortable, and that forgiveness, that self-acceptance, would come in the most unexpected way, not through therapy or self-help books, but through a moment of pure, unadulterated honesty. A moment when I stood in front of a group of strangers and told them my story, in English, without a script, and they listened, not because my English was perfect, but because my story was real, and that moment, that terrifying, exhilarating moment, would change everything. It would transform me from a woman who could not say coffee into a woman who could teach English to hundreds of people. And it would teach me that the past is not something to be ashamed of. It is something to be shared because your past, my past, our pasts, can become someone else's future, and that is the most powerful lesson I have ever learned. The day I spoke without a script. Imagine standing in front of a room full of strangers, your palms sweating, your heart racing, your mouth dry, and you are about to speak. Not in your native language, but in English, the language that has been your greatest enemy and your most stubborn teacher, and you have no script. No notes, no safety net, just you and your story, and the terrifying freedom of saying whatever comes out. And that was me on a rainy Tuesday morning at a community center in Queens, standing in front of a group of 15 immigrants from 15 different countries. All of them looking at me with the same mixture of hope and fear that I had worn like a second skin for years. And I opened my mouth and I said, "My name is Mai, and I am here to tell you that if I can learn English, anyone can." And then I told them my story, the whole story. From the subway station where I could not order coffee to the wedding where I could not say cherish to the kitchen where I almost destroyed my marriage over a can of tomato sauce. And as I spoke, something strange happened, something I had never experienced before. I stopped worrying about my grammar. I stopped second-guessing my word choices. I stopped apologizing for my accent. I just let the words flow. And they were not perfect. They were never perfect. But they were real. They were honest. They were mine. And the people in that room were not judging me. They were leaning in. They were nodding. They were seeing themselves in my story. And when I finished, there was a moment of silence. And then a woman from Colombia started crying and said, "That is exactly how I feel. I thought I was the only one." And a man from Syria raised his hand and said, "I cannot say anything in English. I am so scared." And I looked at him and I said, "That is okay. You do not have to be perfect. You just have to try." And in that moment, I understood something that would change my entire life, something that no textbook or language app could ever teach me. The thing I had been missing all along was not vocabulary or grammar or pronunciation. It was purpose. I had been learning English for myself. To survive, to succeed, to prove something to the world, but I had never thought about using English to help others, to connect with people who were going through the same struggles I had gone through. And suddenly, the whole purpose of my journey became clear. I had not gone through all that pain just to get a better job or fit in better. I had gone through it so that I could stand in front of that room and say, "I see you. I understand you. You are not alone." And that realization was so powerful, so overwhelming, that I almost started crying right there in front of everyone. but I held it together. I smiled and I said, let us start with something simple. Let us start with hello and my name is, and we will go from there. And we did. We started small. We stumbled and laughed and made mistakes. And it was beautiful. It was messy and imperfect and absolutely beautiful. And I walked out of that community center that day feeling lighter than I had felt in years, because I had finally found my purpose. Not as a student of English, but as a teacher. Not because I knew everything, but because I knew what it felt like to know nothing, and that empathy, that shared experience, made me a better teacher than any degree or certificate ever could. And I started teaching regularly. And each class taught me something new, not just about English, but about people, about resilience, about the incredible courage it takes to start over in a new language. And I learned that my students were not just learning from me. I was learning from them, learning about their cultures, their struggles, their dreams. And every time one of them had a breakthrough, every time someone who could not say a single word 3 months ago told a story in English, I felt a joy that I cannot put into words. And I realized that teaching was not just a job, it was a calling. It was the thing I had been searching for my whole life without knowing it. And the more I taught, the more my own English improved, because I was using it every day. I was living in it. I was breathing it. And the fear that had haunted me for so long, the fear of making mistakes, of sounding stupid, of being judged, that fear just melted away. Because I was too busy helping others to worry about myself. And that is the secret that nobody tells you. The secret that transforms language learning from a struggle into a joy. You stop obsessing over your own performance and start focusing on connection, on communication, on the beautiful, messy, human act of sharing stories. And once you make that shift, everything changes. Your accent becomes a mark of your journey. Your mistakes become opportunities for laughter and learning. Your broken English becomes a bridge instead of a barrier. And I started to realize that the best teachers are not the ones who know the most, but the ones who remember what it felt like to know nothing. The ones who can sit with a terrified student and say, I was where you are, I know how hard it is, and I am here to help you through it. And I became that teacher, not because I was special, but because I had suffered, because I had struggled, because I had failed and gotten back up so many times that failure no longer scared me. And that freedom, that liberation from the fear of being imperfect, was the greatest gift I ever gave myself. And it was also the greatest gift I could give my students, because when they saw me make a mistake and laugh about it, they felt permission to make mistakes too. They felt permission to be human, and that permission, that release from the pressure to be perfect, was the key to their progress. Because when you are not afraid to fail, you try harder, you take more risks, you learn faster. And I watched my students transform, not because I was a great teacher, but because they gave themselves permission to be imperfect. And that is the lesson I want to leave with you today, because if you are watching this video, if you are struggling with English, if you feel like you will never get it right, I want you to know that you do not have to be perfect. You just have to be willing to try, willing to fail, willing to get back up. And your broken English is not a weakness. It is your strength. It is the evidence that you are brave enough to try something hard. And that courage, that fierce, stubborn courage, is what will carry you through, not just in learning English, but in everything you do. So the next time you feel like giving up, I want you to think of that room in Queens. I want you to think of all the people who started with nothing and built something beautiful. And I want you to know that you can do it too. Because I did it, and if I can do it, anyone can. And that is the truth that has guided me from that freezing subway station to where I am now. Standing here, talking to you, telling you my story in the hope that it becomes part of your story, because that is what teaching really is. It is passing on the lessons you learned so that someone else does not have to learn them the hard way, and my story, as messy and imperfect as it is my gift to you. From ESL student to teacher. The journey from being a terrified ESL student who could not order coffee to becoming the person standing at the front of a classroom, chalk in hand, eyes scanning a room full of faces that mirrored my own fear and hope, was not a straight line. It was not a triumphant march. It was a winding, stumbling, often humiliating path that took me through every possible emotion and left me scarred and wiser and infinitely more grateful. And the moment I realized I was no longer just a student, but a teacher happened not in a classroom, but in a small community center on a rainy Tuesday, when the coordinator, a kind-faced woman named Maria, pulled me aside after my first volunteer session and said, "The students loved you. They said you made them feel safe. They said you understand them in a way other teachers don't. Would you consider teaching a regular class?" And I actually laughed out loud, because the idea of me, the woman who had spent years hiding from conversations, teaching English to anyone seemed absurd. It seemed like a joke, a prank, a cosmic misunderstanding, but Maria was serious. She looked at me with those warm, knowing eyes and said, "You know something that most teachers don't. You know what it feels like to be lost. And that is a gift." And I thought about her words for a long time. I thought about all the teachers I had had in the past. The good ones and the bad ones, the ones who had made me feel stupid, and the ones who had made me feel capable. And I realized that the best teachers I ever had were not the ones with the most impressive credentials or the most flawless grammar. They were the ones who made me feel seen, who made me feel like my struggle mattered, who did not rush me or shame me or make me feel like a burden. And I decided, with a trembling heart and a voice that still stuttered when I was nervous, to say yes, to say I will try. And that decision, that terrifying, exhilarating decision, would change everything, because teaching is not about knowing everything. It is about being willing to learn alongside your students. It is about creating a space where mistakes are not failures but stepping stones, where accents are not flaws but music, where every imperfect sentence is a victory. And I walked into my first official class with my palms sweating and my heart racing, and I looked at the 20 faces staring back at me. Faces from Mexico and China and Syria and Haiti and a dozen other countries. Faces that carried the same exhaustion and determination I had seen in my own mirror for years. And I said, "My name is Mai. And I am not a perfect English speaker. I make mistakes every day, and that is okay, because this class is not about being perfect. It is about being brave." And I watched their shoulders drop. I watched the tension leave their bodies. I watched them exhale, because finally, someone had given them permission to be imperfect, and that permission, that simple, radical permission, was the most powerful teaching tool I had. And we started with the basics. We started with hello and my name is and I am from, and we built from there, slowly, patiently, one word at a time. And every time a student mastered a new phrase, every time someone who had been silent for weeks suddenly spoke up, I felt a joy that no achievement of my own had ever given me. Because I was not just teaching English, I was giving people the tools to tell their own stories, to be seen, to be heard, to be understood. And I learned more from my students than I ever taught them because each one had a story, each one had a struggle, each one had a reason for being in that room, and those stories became my lessons. They became the texture of my teaching. They reminded me every single day that language is not about grammar. It is about connection. It is about the desperate, beautiful human need to say, "This is who I am," and have someone say, "I see you." And I started to notice patterns in my students, patterns that I recognized from my own journey. The ones who were too scared to speak, the ones who apologized before they even opened their mouths, the ones who had been told their whole lives that they were not good enough, and I made it my mission to reach them, to show them that they were more than their mistakes, that their accents were not weaknesses but evidence of their courage, that their broken English was not a sign of failure, but proof that they had traveled a long, difficult road and were still standing. And I remember one student in particular, a young woman from Honduras named Anna, who would not speak, who would just sit in the back of the room with her eyes down, and when I asked her to participate, she would shake her head and whisper, "I cannot." And one day, I sat down next to her and I said, "Anna, do you know that I could not order a coffee when I first came to America?" And she looked up, surprised, and I told her my story. I told her about the subway station and the vending machine and the shame that had almost swallowed me whole, and I told her that if I could learn, she could too, and she started to cry, and I started to cry, and then we both laughed at how ridiculous we looked, and she said in the smallest, most hesitant voice, "I want to try." And that was the beginning of her transformation. And weeks later, when she stood up in front of the class and told her own story in English about leaving her family and her country and everything she had ever known, the whole room erupted in applause, and I stood in the back, tears streaming down my face, and I thought, this is it, this is what I was meant to do. And I realized that my past, all the pain and failure and humiliation, had not been wasted. It had been preparation. It had been training for this moment, for this purpose, for the chance to tell other people that their past did not have to define them, that it could actually become the fuel for their future. And that is the lesson I want to leave with you, because if you are struggling with English, if you feel like you will never get it right, I want you to know that your struggle is not meaningless. It is not a waste. It is your training. It is your preparation for the moment when you will stand in front of someone else and say, "I was where you are and I made it through." And that moment, that act of passing on what you have learned, is the most powerful thing you will ever do. And that is why I am here. That is why I am telling you my story, because I want it to be your lesson. I want it to be the thing that gives you hope when you have none. I want it to be the proof that transformation is possible, that your past can become someone else's future, and that you, yes you, have something to offer that no one else can, because your story is unique, your struggles are unique, and your victory, when it comes, will be a victory that inspires others to keep going. And that is the greatest gift of all, the gift of being able to say, "I survived, and so can you." My children are my translators. The day my daughter started kindergarten, she came home with a drawing of our family, 4 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. And she pointed to each one and said, "This is Daddy, this is Mommy, this is me, and this is my little brother." And she said it all in English, fluent and effortless, without even a trace of an accent. And I felt a strange, complicated knot form in my chest, a knot that was part pride and part grief, because my daughter, my beautiful, brilliant daughter, was becoming American in a way I would never be. She was speaking English like a native. She was making friends with ease. She was navigating this world with a confidence that I still had to fake most days. And while I was overjoyed for her, I also felt a quiet, selfish sadness because I could see my Vietnamese heritage slipping away from her. I could see her becoming someone who would always be more comfortable in English than in Vietnamese. Someone who would never really know the poetry of my mother tongue, someone who would never fully understand the stories that had shaped me. And I tried to hold on. I tried to speak Vietnamese at home. I tried to teach her the songs and the stories and the traditions. But she would answer me in English, not because she was disrespectful, but because English was simply easier for her. It was the language of her friends, her teachers, her cartoons, her whole world, and I felt like I was losing her. Like the gap between us was growing wider with every passing day, and I remember one night, I was tucking her into bed, and I said something to her in Vietnamese, and she looked at me and said, "Mommy, I don't understand. Can you say it in English?" And my heart shattered. It just shattered into 1,000 pieces because my own child could not understand me in my own language. And I realized that if I wanted to stay connected to her, I had to speak her language. I had to speak English, not just passively, but fluently, confidently, completely. And that realization was both a loss and a gift because it forced me to commit to English in a way I never had before. It forced me to stop hiding and start speaking. And as I started speaking more English at home, something magical happened. My daughter started speaking more Vietnamese. Not perfectly, not fluently, but she started trying. She started asking, "How do you say this in Vietnamese, Mommy?" And, "What is the word for that?" And we would practice together. She would teach me English and I would teach her Vietnamese, and we became language partners. Not just mother and daughter, but co-learners, explorers of this strange, beautiful territory between two languages. And I realized that my children were not just my children, they were my translators, my bridges to a world that had once felt so foreign. They were the ones who helped me navigate the complexities of American life. They were the ones who explained idioms to me, who corrected my grammar without making me feel stupid, who translated the cultural code that had always seemed so opaque. And I remember one time, I was struggling to fill out a school form, and my daughter, who was 7 years old, looked over my shoulder and said, "Mommy, that part is asking for your emergency contact. You should put Daddy's number." And she said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, that I almost cried. Because here was this tiny person, this child I had brought into the world, helping me, guiding me, teaching me, and that reversal, that beautiful, humbling reversal, taught me something profound about language and love. It taught me that learning is not a one-way street. It is a circle. It is a dance. It is a constant exchange of giving and receiving, and my children were giving me so much more than I could ever give them. They were giving me the gift of being seen, of being understood, of being included in a world that had once excluded me, and as they grew older, they became my cultural interpreters. They would explain American customs to me. They would teach me the slang that I could not find in any dictionary. They would help me understand the unwritten rules of parenting in America. And I would teach them about Vietnam, about our family history, about the traditions that had shaped generations before them. And that exchange, that constant back and forth, made our family stronger. It made us more resilient. It made us a team. And I started to see my children not as the end of my Vietnamese heritage, but as its continuation, because they were carrying it forward in their own way, in their own hybrid, bilingual, bicultural way, and that was not a loss. It was a transformation. It was the creation of something new, something that had never existed before, and that something was beautiful. It was the blending of two worlds into one family, two languages into one conversation, two cultures into one home. And I realized that the fear I had been carrying, the fear that I was losing my identity, was unfounded because identity is not a fixed thing. It is not a possession you can lose. It is a living, breathing thing that evolves and grows and changes, and my identity was not being erased. It was being expanded. It was being enriched. It was becoming something richer and more complex than it had ever been. And my children were the architects of that expansion. They were the ones who showed me that I could be Vietnamese and American at the same time, that I could love both languages, that I could belong to two worlds and be richer for it. And I started to feel a peace that I had never felt before. A peace that came from accepting that I would never be fully one thing or the other, that I would always be in between. And that in between was not a weakness. It was a strength. It was a unique perspective that gave me a depth of understanding that most people never achieve. And I wanted to share that perspective. I want to teach it to other people who are struggling with the same fears, the same questions, the same longing for belonging, and that desire, that burning desire to help others, would lead me to the final chapter of my story. The chapter where I would stand in front of a classroom and say, "Your past is not your prison. It is your power." And the chapter where I would finally, fully, embrace the truth that had been there all along. The truth that my broken English had led me to my purpose, that my struggles had shaped me into someone who could help others, and that my children, my beautiful, bilingual, bicultural children, were the living proof that transformation is possible, that love can bridge any gap. That language is not a barrier but a doorway, and that doorway was now wide open, inviting me to walk through it into a future I had never dared to imagine. Your past is someone's future lesson. And now, here I am, standing at the end of the story that began with a frozen subway station and a cup of coffee I could not order. A story that took me through the loneliness of a foreign winter, the terror of falling in love in a language I barely spoke, the near destruction of my marriage, the birth of my children who became my translators, and finally, the unexpected gift of becoming a teacher. And I want you to understand something that took me years to learn, something that no textbook, no app, no language course will ever teach you. Your past is not a burden. It is not a source of shame. It is not something to be hidden or apologized for. Your past is your power. It is your unique gift. It is the raw material from which you can build something extraordinary. And if you are watching this video right now, if you are struggling with English, if you feel like you are failing, if you feel like giving up, I want you to hear me when I say this. The very things that make you feel inadequate, the accent that marks you as foreign, the grammar mistakes that make you cringe, the moments of confusion when you cannot find the right word, those are not signs of failure. They are signs of courage. They are proof that you are doing something hard, something brave, something that millions of people never even try. And that courage, that willingness to be imperfect, is the most valuable thing you possess, because it means you are alive, you are growing, you are refusing to let fear win. And I know how hard it is. I know the weight of that shame. I know the exhaustion of constantly translating yourself. I know the loneliness of feeling like you do not belong. I know all of it because I lived it. I lived it every single day for years, and there were moments when I thought I would never make it. Moments when I wanted to give up. Moments when I was so tired of struggling that I just wanted to crawl into a hole and disappear. But I did not give up. I kept going, one word at a time, one conversation at a time, one day at a time, and slowly, painfully, beautifully. I built a life, not a perfect life, not a life without struggle, but a life that is mine, a life that I am proud of, a life that I can look back on and say, I did that, I survived that, I grew from that. And that is the message I want to leave with you. Because your story, my story, all of our stories, they are connected, they are part of a larger tapestry of human experience. And when you share your story, when you are brave enough to say, this is who I am, this is where I came from, this is what I have been through, you give other people permission to share theirs. You create a space where shame can be replaced by connection, where isolation can be replaced by community, where fear can be replaced by hope, and that is what I am doing right now. I am sharing my story so that it can become part of your story, so that you can see yourself in it and know that you are not alone. And I want you to take that with you. I want you to carry it in your heart, because there will be days when you feel like giving up. There will be days when you feel like you are not making progress. There will be days when you want to scream because the words just will not come. And on those days, I want you to remember this. Every single person who has ever learned a new language has been where you are. Every single person who has ever built a new life in a new country has felt what you are feeling. Every single person who has ever struggled to find the right word has known that frustration, and they made it through, and so will you. Because you are stronger than you know, you are more resilient than you believe, and you have something precious that no one can take away from you. Your story, your unique, irreplaceable story, and that story, with all its imperfections, all its detours, all its beautiful brokenness, is the thing that will carry you forward. It is the thing that will connect you to others. It is the thing that will make you a teacher, a guide, a light for someone else who is just beginning their journey. And that is the greatest gift of all. The gift of being able to say, I was where you are and I made it through. And when you say that, when you offer that gift to someone else, you are not just helping them, you are completing your own journey. You are turning your struggle into meaning, your pain into purpose, your past into someone else's future. And that is what I have done. That is what I continue to do every day, not because I am special, but because I am willing to be imperfect, willing to share, willing to connect, and I want you to know that you can do the same. You can take your broken English, your imperfect accent, your struggle, and you can turn it into something beautiful. You can use it to help someone else. You can use it to build a life, a community, a purpose, and that is the real miracle, not fluency, not perfection, but connection, the simple, profound, life-changing act of connecting with another human being. And that is why I am here. That is why I made this video. That is why I am telling you my story, because I want you to know that your past is not a liability. It is an asset. It is not something to be left behind. It is something to be carried forward. It is not a weight. It is wings, and you can fly with them. You can soar. You can reach heights you never imagined. And when you do, you will look back and realize that every mistake, every stumble, every moment of shame was part of the path, was part of the becoming, was part of the beautiful, messy, magnificent journey that made you who you are. And that person, the one you are becoming, is someone who can look at the future and say, I am ready. I am not afraid. Because I have already survived the hardest part. And that is the truth. The hardest part is not learning the grammar, not memorizing the vocabulary, not perfecting the pronunciation. The hardest part is believing in yourself. And once you really believe that you can do this, the rest is just details, the rest is just practice, the rest is just the joyful, frustrating, exhilarating work of becoming. And I believe in you, I really do, because I have seen it. I have seen people who could not say a single word become fluent. I have seen people who were terrified of speaking become confident. I have seen people who thought they would never belong become community leaders, and it was not magic, it was not talent, it was courage. Plain and simple, the courage to try, the courage to fail, the courage to keep going. And that courage is inside you, I know it is, because you're still here, you're still watching, you're still searching for answers, and that means you have not given up. That means you are still fighting, and that is everything. That is the whole battle. That is the victory right there. In your willingness to keep going, and I want you to keep going. I want you to keep speaking, keep making mistakes, keep laughing at yourself. Keep trying, because every attempt, every effort, every stumble brings you closer to the person you want to become, and that person, the one who can speak English with confidence, the one who can tell their own story, the one who can connect with anyone, anywhere. That person is already inside you. They're just waiting for you to give them permission to emerge. And I am giving you that permission right now. I am telling you that it is okay to be imperfect. It is okay to make mistakes. It is okay to struggle. Because struggle is the soil in which growth happens, and you are growing, you are becoming, you are transforming. And that transformation is beautiful. And I am so proud of you. I am so proud of every single person who is on this journey. Because I know how hard it is. I know how much courage it takes. And I want you to know that you are not alone. You are part of a community. A global community of people who are doing the same thing. People who are learning, growing, struggling, and succeeding. And that community is powerful. That community is unstoppable. And you are a part of it. You belong here. You belong in this space. And I am so grateful that you are here, that you are watching, that you are listening, and that you are still trying, because that is everything. That is the whole point. And now, as I bring this story to a close, I want to leave you with one final thought. One last piece of wisdom that I have learned through all of this. The past is not a prison, it is a classroom. And you are both the student and the teacher. And every lesson you learn, every challenge you overcome, becomes a lesson you can teach someone else. And that is the legacy we leave behind. Not the perfection of our grammar, but the kindness of our connection. Not the fluency of our speech, but the authenticity of our hearts. And that is what I have tried to give you today. Not just a language lesson, but a heart lesson. A lesson about courage and resilience and the incredible power of being human. And I hope it has helped you. I hope it has touched you. I hope it has given you a little bit of hope, because that is all any of us really need, just a little bit of hope to keep going. And I am giving you that hope right now, freely, with all my heart, because you deserve it. You deserve to believe in yourself. You deserve to keep going. You deserve to become the person you are meant to be. My story is over, but yours is just beginning. And now, as I sit here in my small home office, looking at the photos on my wall, my wedding, my children's first steps, my first class of students, I realized that this journey was never really about me. It was about you. It was about the moment you would find this video. Click on it and recognize yourself in my story, because I know you are out there. I know you are struggling. I know you are tired. I know you have been trying for months, maybe years, and you still feel like you are not good enough. And I want you to know that I see you. I feel you. I was you, and the reason I am telling you all of this is not to impress you or to make you feel sorry for me. It is to give you something I never had when I was standing in that freezing subway station. It is to give you proof that transformation is real. That broken English can become a bridge, that a woman who could not order coffee can become a teacher, a mother, a storyteller, and if I can do it, you can do it too. That is not a cliche, that is not empty motivation, that is a fact, a biological, neurological, undeniable fact. Because your brain is just as capable as mine. Your heart is just as brave. Your spirit is just as resilient. The only thing standing between you and the English you want to speak is the fear that you cannot. And fear, as I have learned, is a liar. It is a thief. It is the voice that tells you to give up right before the breakthrough. And I am here to tell you that your breakthrough is coming. It might not come tomorrow. It might not come next week. But if you keep going, if you keep speaking, if you keep making mistakes and laughing and trying again, it will come. And when it comes, it will be the most beautiful feeling in the world. Because you will realize that you did it. You overcame the thing that scared you most. You proved that voice wrong. And that victory, that personal, private victory, will change everything. It will change how you see yourself, how you move through the world, how you connect with others. And that is the gift I want to leave with you, the gift of believing in yourself, because once you believe, nothing can stop you, not the accent, not the grammar, not the people who make you feel small. You will be unstoppable, and that is the future I see for you. A future where you speak English with confidence, where you share your story with the world, where you become the teacher, the mentor, the inspiration for someone else who is just beginning. And that is the circle. That is the beauty of it all. We are all connected. We are all learning from each other. We are all passing on the lessons we have learned, and my story, your story, every story becomes part of a larger story, a story of human courage and resilience, and the incredible, stubborn refusal to give up. And that is the story I want to keep telling. That is the story I want this channel to be about, not just English lessons, but life lessons. Not just grammar, but growth. Not just fluency, but freedom. And I'm going to keep making videos, keep sharing stories, keep building this community. Because I believe in it, I believe in you, and I want you to be part of it. I want you to subscribe, not because I need the numbers, but because I need you. I need your story. I need your questions. I need your struggles and your victories. Because every time you share something, every time you comment, every time you reach out, you remind me why I started this. You remind me that we are in this together, and together, we are unstoppable. So please, if this video touched you, if my story made you feel less alone, if you want to continue this journey with me, hit that subscribe button right now. Click the bell so you never miss a video, and leave a comment telling me your story. Tell me where you are from, what you are struggling with, what you are hoping to achieve, because I read every comment, I see every message, and I want to know you. I want to be part of your journey just as you have been part of mine, and I promise you, I will keep making videos that help you, that inspire you, that remind you that you are not alone, because this is not just a channel. It is a community. It is a family. It is a space where we can all be imperfect together, where we can make mistakes and learn and grow and laugh. And that is the most beautiful thing in the world. So please, take a moment right now, hit that subscribe button, and let us continue this journey together, because my story is over. But yours is just beginning, and I cannot wait to see where it takes you. That is all for today. I will make many more similar videos in the future. Please subscribe to watch them.